Folks, my guest today has served as a writer and editor for outlets like Crunchyroll, Cracked, Wired, and Vulture. He's also the author of Monster Kids: How Pokemon Taught a Generation to Catch Them All. His new book, I Am the Night: The Ultimate Unauthorized History of Batman, the Animated Series, comes out September 1st. Daniel Dockery is on the line. Daniel, how are you, sir?
I'm doing very well. How are you, Rob?
Excellent. Daniel, did you anticipate that it would be so difficult to say the title of your book without slipping into a Kevin Conroy impression, as I almost did there?
I haven't been a Batman the Animated Series fan for long enough to know that it's impossible to read anything Batman related without kind of hearing Conroy's voice in the
Yes.
back. Hamish Linklater, who did the voice of Batman in the new Cape Crusader cartoon,
Uh-huh.
put it. He was like, I think he said, Kevin Conroy's Batman was the voice of my God, and I think any Batman fan, it's kind of impossible to read even the comics most far away from what the animated series is going for. You read it in Conroy's voice. So yeah, no, I have the same problem. Yep.
Okay, even though the title is a little bit self-explanatory, can you tell us what I Am the Night is about? What is the book?
So I Am the Night is about the development and creation of Batman the Animated Series. Uh, Probably one of the most famous cartoons, not just of the 90s, but of all time. But
Okay.
it also kind of dives into the era in which the show was formed, which is, the early 90s, and why that was such a fruitful period for televised animation. So, you come for the Batman and you stay for, a greater appreciation of animation as a medium, I hope.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, so who were you able to talk to for the book about the Batman show specifically? I saw Bruce Timm's name was mentioned, and of course, he was such a central figure in the development of the show. But who'd you get to talk to?
So funnily enough, a lot of people except for Bruce Timm.
Really?
Yeah, I was kind of steered away from that fairly early, Bruce Timm has given a lot of interviews
Yeah,
about Batman the Animated Series in the past.
of course.
But as far back as I think it's either 1999 or 2000, he gave an interview where he was like, I'm tired of answering questions about Batman the Animated Series. And I was like, I get it. If you've spent a decade being asked questions about Batman, you probably want to please ask me about Justice League or anything.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
But aside from that, there's luckily, again, there's a wealth of interview material, both published and non-published, yet with Bruce Timm. And I was luckily able to interview a lot of the other architects of the series. Like I talked to Eric Radomski, Alan Burnett, Paul Dini, and a lot of writers, directors, composers, people that worked on the business side of things. I really tried to get a hold of everyone that I could. There were some, that it didn't happen, some that, they passed away while I was kind of formulating the book together.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I managed to talk to a lot of people, and I felt like I got a lot of great stuff from them. And a lot of people were very, very generous with their time as well. So I got pretty lucky, I think.
Were you starstruck at any point? I mean, you those three names you mentioned. I mean, I know those names from coming up watching DVD extras and documentaries and stuff like that. I mean, like somebody like Paul Dini, are you starstruck when you talk to these people? I mean, what's that experience like?
Paul Dini is so smart and humble and has such a. There are some people that kind of go into cartoons not really meaning to be, or they don't kind of believe in the efficacy of cartoons.
Hmm.
But Paul Dini is such a cartoon true believer. He is so the power of the medium.
Yes.
And I remember when I talked to him, I just earlier that day, I had been laboring and kind of agonizing over the fact that I thought I was calling Batman too often. Like you kind of throw in a few Dark Knights, World Greatest Detective, Cape
Yeah.
Crusader, that
Right.
kind of thing, kind of spice it up. But I was like, oh my gosh, I cannot be going into an interview with the Batman cartoon writer if I'm worried about calling Batman Batman too much. So it was very, but a lot of yeah, again, he was so smart and curious about, his chosen art form. And he was just great. A lot of those guys wiped away my nerves immediately just because of how kind they were and how generous they were with their time. And
Right.
that no one gave a bad answer. Sometimes you kind of talk to someone that has talked this subject over and over again, and they kind of give you the cliffs notes of like whatever you actually want to talk about. But
Yeah.
nobody did. They were also like, I know that, like, you know for example, I know Paul Dini has gone over the Heart of Ice story
Yeah.
a million times. And I was like, I'd read his take on the creation of that episode, probably a dozen times before I started writing the book.
Sure.
And I was like, what can I get anything out of this? Is he going to want to dive any deeper into this? And luckily he was open to all of my questions about it. So yeah, it
Oh.
was fantastic.
So we were talking before we hit the record button here, and you're a little bit younger than me, but we
Hmm.
both grew up with the show.
Hmm.
I mean, do you remember the first time you saw it? Do you remember initial reactions to it? Do you remember your first episode? What do you remember about when you first saw the show?
So you probably have a stronger, like I guess a more tangible memory of this than I do. But
Hmm.
my first memory of the show was, do you remember the little bumpers, not the bumpers, but the kind of the previews after the show where
Yep.
like that old-timey mid-Atlantic accent would talk
Uh-huh.
as like the newsreaders, like tomorrow on Batman,
Yeah.
like ruthless
That guy.
gangsters invade Gotham. Like
Hmm.
that kind of thing. And it was so like singular. No other shows had previews for like the next episode, but none had that kind of thing. And that's the first memory I have of like sitting on my living room floor and being like, nothing I'm watching on TV feels like this.
Hmm.
Um, I Batman, the more I wrote about it, the more I realized I remembered about it. But it was really a show that only started taking hold in the years following, when I'd catch, like, either reruns on Fox Kids or later when Batman became a part of the Kids WB lineup,
Yeah.
and I started getting it more and more. Back in '92, I was 3 years
Yeah.
old, so I get like little
Yeah.
blurs of memories. But a
Uh-huh.
few years later is when I would like, oh, this like really oddly sad show is like a real, like, it isn't like a toddler fever dream, like, oh,
Mm.
this show existed.
Yeah.
So those are my first memories, but what are yours?
Oh
uh
God. I think my first memory of the show was the Christmas with the Joker episode.
mhm,
And what's interesting about that episode, I remember the DVD orders for the episodes as opposed
mhm,
to the episodes as they came out on television, but I remember
mhm,
that was one of the I seem to recall it was one of the first episodes they did, and you can kind of tell because Kevin Conroy, they're still figuring themselves out at that point, but Kevin Conroy talks a little bit like Adam West, a tiny
mhm,
bit, at least in my mind. But I mean, Mark Hamill is there as the Joker, and it was just it had an epic feel about it, an
mhm,
epic dramatic feel about it. And like you said, there was nothing else, and to a large extent, there still is nothing else on TV
mhm.
quite like it.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. I think Christmas with the Joker, though the show would do better episodes, there's one of the things I like most about that episode is that is Hamill really, like, Mark Hamill got the Joker so immediately,
Mm-hmm.
like, it really clicks. And like, while the writing of episodes kind of would have, it took a little while for them to kind of like, okay, this is our Joker.
Yeah.
Hamill got it
Mm-hmm.
immediately. So I think that's my favorite part of the episode is, the show is still trying to find itself, but Hamill is so fully formed with
Yes.
that laugh and that, like, that sadistic humor and like kind of playfulness with it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, so you're all grown up now,
Yes.
obviously, at least physically. So what's the genesis of the idea for the book? You had written Monster Kids by this
Mhm.
point, right?
Yes.
And so it was Batman the Animated Series just sort of the next in line, or I mean, what prompted you to start the book?
After I got done with Monster Kids and that was out, I knew I wanted to do something about superheroes.
Okay.
And my two kind of superhero fixations, I guess you'd call it, were always Batman and Spider-Man, which
Okay.
is nothing new. They're Marvel's, basically Marvel spokesman and DC
Yeah,
spokesman.
they're the flagship
Um,
characters.
yeah. And Spider-Man, I've always kind of, if a book idea for Spider-Man ever like ignites, I'll maybe try it out. But Spider-Man has kind of swirled in my head as ideas rather than like
Yeah.
what a cohesive story would need to be.
Okay.
But I knew I wanted to write something about Batman, and for a little while I was working. A book about Batman the animated series had always kind of floated in the nether of the back of my skull. But I
Hmm.
knew that I wanted to do something about Batman, and an idea about Batman as part of a wider comic book movie adaptation thing kind of took shape for a little while. But
Okay.
it just wasn't getting to where like me or the people I was working with needed it to be.
Okay.
And eventually my agent was like, so do you want to kind of move on to something else? And I was like, okay. He'd never watched an episode of Batman the Animated Series, or at least he couldn't
Ooh.
remember watching an episode. I know.
Okay.
But I was like, I know you've never watched an episode, but I'm still on this like write about Batman train.
Okay.
And if I do something else in a few years, I'm not sure I'm still going to have the enthusiasm I feel like in my gut right now.
Yeah.
So I wrote up a proposal for it for a Batman the Animated Series book. And luckily enough, St. Martin's Press, our publisher, picked it up. But yeah, for a little while, it was basically like, it kind of came as like, if I don't write this book now, I'm not sure I'm ever going to,
Hmm.
because I know that like if I leave it, I will become obsessed with something else,
Yeah.
and I'm not sure I was at like peak obsessed with everything Batman at that point, and Batman the Animated Series is one of my favorite shows of all time. So I needed to get this book out right then at that moment.
Yeah, sometimes you just got to strike when the creative iron is hot. I mean, I can vouch
Yeah,
for that to a smaller extent, but yeah, I mean, sometimes if you miss your window, you miss your window.
yeah, absolutely.
So, okay, even as a Batman the Animated Series buff, I know that I'm gonna read this book and I'm gonna learn things, or at least that's my anticipation. I'm gonna learn things that I didn't know coming into it. And I'm somebody that's,
Mhm,
watched DVD extras and
mhm.
documentaries and read interviews and all that kind of stuff. Can you give us a little nugget, a little teaser maybe of something that you learned in writing the book, something that, you found out that you didn't know about?
There's a lot of stories of production from the production side of things that have only gotten kind of one that only really has like one popular view of, that I
Okay.
tried to get a more well-rounded view of, like you'll get inklings here and there of how a story turned out. And some of that comes from the Batman animated book that Paul Dini did about 25 years ago. That's sadly
I've,
out of print now. It's one of
I've
the
got
best
that
art
book.
books of all time. It's
Yeah,
fantastic.
absolutely.
Um, or it'll be an interview with a specific director or specific writer or a specific producer. So one of my biggest aims of the book was kind of like, okay, I want to take some of these stories and kind of flesh them out so that you get a real start to finish of it from everybody's side. I think if there's any story that also I really wanted to tell, it was the story of Sean Derrick, who was Batman the Animated Series' first like main story editor.
Okay.
Because historically, the kind of history of it goes that Sean Derrick came in, her views didn't mesh with what she wanted, didn't really mesh with what everybody else wanted, and then she
Okay.
was out, and then Alan Burnett kind of came in.
Okay.
But I was like, this feels kind of half formed. This feels like it feels in a way like, oh, the victors told this story. And so
Yeah.
I went to Sean Derrick herself, and I was like, would you care to talk to me about it? Luckily she did. I went to a few of the writers that she hired that kind of faded out of the show when she wasn't a part of it anymore, and I talked to some of them. And I really wanted to, I think That's one of my favorite sections of trying to get a full 360 of all of the differing viewpoints of what was happening and like where at the time. And like, I think it made the book better. I hope it did. But I think that's probably one of the best examples of my aim of like, let's take all these stories that have become kind of like Batman the Animated Series mythology and kind of make them real people stories.
All right, Danny, I want to put you in the hot seat now. Okay. Favorite Batman the Animated Series episode or episodes? How about you give me 3 and I'll give you 3.
Okay. My 3 favorite episodes. So I think I was just thinking about this the other day. I think Two-Face Part 1 is a perfect episode of television. It's such even though it's a little bit light on Batman and a little bit heavy on like Harvey Dent seeing a therapist.
Yeah.
Which is a fantastic. How many 90s adventure cartoons included like a therapy scene, an extended therapy scene?
Yeah, exactly. If any.
Kids watching Fox Kids Afternoon were like, yeah, Batman, and then they're like, oh, okay, yeah, that's psychotherapy with Harvey Dent. Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
So Two-Face Part 1, it's fantastic. It's very well directed. I'm gonna have to say Feet of Clay Part 2, if only for being like an animation like powerhouse. The final scene, like all of Clayface's gooey transformations, look fantastic. But the kind of like the death scene in the end, is so beautiful and such a stunning example of TMS, the animation suit. Yeah,
it looks great. He transforms into all kinds of different forms and
all of his different acting roles and stuff.
Yeah,
and also it includes one of my favorite Batman scenes in general in history when he's cornered Germs in the in like the germ room essentially. Yeah, he's like, oh, Crimson Fever, lousy way to go, and he sets it up on the mantle and punches the wall until it comes closer. That's so like, it's so perfect for Batman, because sometimes people frame Batman intimidation scenes as, especially in recent stuff, as a little too mean. Yeah. But that is perfect. That is like, I'm not going to like, it's like it uses their fear against them, their paranoia against them, which is fantastic. And what is probably number 3 would have to be gonna pick it's something tough, isn't it? It is so tough. I'm gonna pick something that's probably, I don't know if it's a lot of people's favorites, but I really love Read My Lips. The Scarface introduction episode. I really love Read My Lips. It's it's got this great script by Joe Lansdale, and I just adore that episode. And I think it was also a lot of people's introduction to like Scarface and the Ventriloquist. Yeah. Because compared to a lot of the other villains that they'd used, which were mostly like Golden Age, like Joker, Catwoman stuff, Scarface was relatively new. And same with like Ra's al Ghul is like again like a few decades old. But in DC Comics history, relatively new. It hadn't appeared in the 60s series, which is another big one, which is where a whole generation of people kind of got their idea of who Batman villains were. There hadn't been a movie made about them yet. I hadn't been a blockbuster movie made about them yet. Right. So yeah, I really like Read My Lips. It's just a very well put together, like freakish noir episode. Yeah, definitely. But what about your 3? Oh gosh, I love Heart of Ice. I mean, it's the cliche answer, but I mean that became the definitive Mr. Freeze story, and I mean it's good. It's great. I mean, it wasn't, you didn't have that kind of background information about Victor Freeze before that, and of course there's a Paul Dini episode. Am I right? Yeah, he injected all that in. He changed the character. He changed the lore forever, really. The Laughing Fish, which is of course based it's very good. That's if I'm inclined to watch the show at any given point at random, that's usually the episode I toss on, just because it's one of my favorite Mark Hamill episodes. And then I'm gonna say Robin's Reckoning. Robin's Reckoning Part 1, the Dick Grayson origin story. Did they win the Emmy for that one? They did.
Yeah, that's okay. Okay, so maybe my answers are a little too cliche, but no, I mean I love those episodes. Those are the ones I keep going back to over and over again.
I love all three of those. The Laughing Fish was one I was just thinking about as well because first of all, it's got like again, it's got a great Mark Hamill performance. The score, this kind of horror movie score, is fantastic.
Hmm.
And I love just the kind of like the opening plot of like the Joker like kind of picking on this guy. You can't copyright fish; they're a natural resource. Like that kind of thing. That's so weird, and he makes it. Hamill makes can make anything work with the Joker. But
Yeah.
it's such a good showcase of everything he was about.
Do you after Kevin Conroy died tragically several years back, Mark Hamill, I think,
Mhm.
came out and said, "Okay, if Kevin's not around, I'm not going to do the Joker anymore because it wouldn't be right for me to be the Joker without him as my Batman." Does
Mhm.
does that sound about right to you? You think that's a good take?
Yes.
Yeah.
Obviously it's his choice.
Yeah.
But I think, the two, I remember when Conroy passed away, Mark Hamill, one of his, I think he tweeted this out, was, "I loved him like a brother."
Hmm.
Which means that, a lot of times in cartoons, they wouldn't all record in the same studio.
Right.
But in Batman the Animated Series, along with a few others, it wasn't alone in this, but in Batman the Animated Series, they'd all record episodes in kind of like old-timey radio show thing where
Hmm.
they'd all be there. And it means that they'd all kind of, energy, if you're feeling the energy on like an episode, it like bounces from performer to performer to performer. And that's
Yeah.
a very kind of, it's not a distant experience like many people imagine voice acting to be. It's a very intimate experience. And I think, not just because they work together so much, but they formed this kind of like, they formed a kind of bond in this way of like,
Yeah.
you learn how to play off each other. You learn that like, when you go big, I go this way, and when I go this way, you go this way. And
Hmm.
that's again, Mark will say, "I love them like a brother." That's how you feel with like a sibling, is you kind of learn all of their little ticks, and like, sometimes so you can antagonize them with it later, but
Yeah.
sometimes because they become ingrained in you, and how they work becomes ingrained in like your spirit. So I think he has every right to say no more Joker, because I don't think I think he's probably well aware that like, he'll never be able to top that.
No.
And also, why would he want to? His time, it also means that the Joker was his Joker and Conroy's Batman was something, was far more special than like a gig. It was
Hmm.
like, we have this relationship. And I think that's special.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, as evidence, they brought them back together so many times, not just
Yeah.
for the Arkham games later on, but I mean, for various different movies and one-offs and things
Hmm.
like that. I mean, generational casting by
Yeah,
Andrea Romano.
absolutely.
Okay, so real quick, what is the legacy of Batman the Animated Series? That's a big question to throw at you with a real quick in front of it, but I mean, to an extent, that's what your book is about. So, I mean, in your mind, what's the legacy of the show?
The legacy of the show. So I think I bring this up in the book a little bit, but superhero media, as with most media, tends to run in cycles.
Hmm.
Where you'll see a movie will come out, and people will be like, "This movie's great," or "This movie's bad," and then a few years later, people will be like, "That bad movie we thought was bad was actually good," or "This movie we thought was good was actually bad."
Hmm.
And it goes through this over and over and over again. But kind of from the beginning, Batman the Animated Series, it's always just been good. It's relatively it's unassailable. Its legacy is kind of impenetrable in that way. I can
Hmm.
find no like I can find no eras in which people were like, the show actually wasn't very good.
Hmm.
I know that there are people who don't like it, but everyone who I've met who doesn't like it has at least been able to admit like, oh, the show had a great impact. Um, I think that's one thing, and I think that's definitely helped Batman the Animated Series rendition of Batman and like Gotham City and its mythology is kind of almost definitive. One of the closest things to definitive that Batman has.
Hmm.
Um, but I'd also say that the legacy is, I think if you watch what's happening to animation right now is tragic in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
Studios get defunded, there's a for some on an executive level, there's some obvious distaste, or not even distaste, just indifference to animation.
Yeah,
They
they
view it
write it
as
off.
kind of the lowest ranking thing of what they want to produce.
Yeah.
And it always changes whenever they have a hit show where they're like, we're gonna do this, and then
Mhm.
as soon as things don't make $1 million a second, they're like, animation doesn't really work for us.
Right.
And so you talk to a lot of animators who have worked in eras like this, because it's not the first time it happened. It might not have ever been this potently bad, but you've had eras over time when people in different studios thought that animation, like, kind of unnecessary, like jangling keys for kids.
Yeah.
But Batman the Animated Series, like, its story kind of shows what happens when you get the right talent together at the right time with the right resources and also the right freedom given to them. Like, it wasn't an iconoclastic, like, free-for-all thing. Like, they very much had, like, executive and, like, network oversight to do what they did. But there was also this sense of, okay, these people, these creative staff working here, they know what they're doing, and we should trust them more often than we don't.
Mm-hmm.
And that, rather than become like a playground or like, an inmates running the asylum kind of thing, it became this, masterpiece of a show.
Yeah.
That almost 35 years later, we're still pointing to as like that is what cartoons should be.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah. So I think that's probably one of its main legacies, along with being a pseudo-definitive Batman tale, is this very this very inspiring story of people getting to create a cartoon, with all what they being able to do the jobs that they do well, and being supported by people that admired them and knew they would do that well, because that's all too rare, especially nowadays.
I believe it. I believe it, my guy.